Montana. The winter of 1887. The snow beneath her feet was red. Harlan lay on the cabin floor, jaw locked, a strip of iron buried deep in his thigh and bleeding fast. Joe's hands wouldn't stop shaking the knife, still smoking from the hearth, blade glowing faint orange in the firelight. This wasn't the first time she'd held a knife like this. The last time she'd driven it into a man to save her own life. Harlan opened his eyes, found hers, and through locked teeth, he forced out the words, "Deeper, don't stop. You're almost there." Joe's grip tightened around the handle. Tears blurred her vision, but her hand did not pull back. Stay with me, because this story won't let you breathe until the very last chapter. The storm came without warning. 1 hour the sky was gray and still. The next, it was screaming. Harlan Cross had lived in these Montana mountains long enough to know what a widowmaker blizzard looked like. He'd seen them bury whole herds. He'd seen them take men who knew better. He shuttered the barn, doubled the feed, checked the latch on every stall door twice. Then he went inside, bolted his own door, and told himself the world could handle itself until morning. He was halfway through a cold supper when he heard it. Not the wind. He knew the wind. This was something else underneath it, a sound that didn't belong to the storm. High and broken and human, he sat very still with his fork in his hand. There it was again. Harlan was on his feet before the thought fully formed. He pulled on his coat, his hat, his gloves, and shoved through the door into a wall of white so thick he could barely see his own hand stretched out in front of him. The cold hit like something solid. It pressed against his chest and stole the air right out of his lungs. He bent his head and pushed forward anyway, moving toward the sound on instinct, because out here in weather like this, sounds like that only meant one thing. He almost tripped over her. She was face down at the edge of his property line, half buried already, one arm stretched out as if she'd been reaching for something when she fell. For a terrible second, he thought he was too late. Then her fingers moved just barely, just a tremor, and he dropped to one knee in the snow beside her. "Hey!" He put his hand near her face, not on it. "Hey, can you hear me?" Nothing. He got his arms under her and lifted. She was light in a way that scared him. Not the lightness of a small woman, the lightness of a person who'd been running on, empty for too long. She didn't stir as he turned back toward the cabin. He tucked her face against his collar to shield it from the wind and moved as fast as he dared on ground he couldn't see. Inside, he laid her down on the rug in front of the hearth and got the fire built up fast. The light caught her face, and he stopped for just a moment. Young, maybe mid-20s, dark hair matted to her cheek with snow, and something darker dried blood, though he couldn't tell from where. Her lips had gone the wrong color. Her skin was the pale gray of someone the cold was already claiming. He'd seen frostbite before. He knew what it did if you moved too slow. "I'm going to take your boots off now," he said, even though her eyes were closed. "Just your boots." He unlaced them carefully, peeled away the soaked wool of her socks. Her toes were white and waxy on one foot, mottled red on the other. He pressed the back of his hand against the sole of her foot, no warmth there at all. He wrapped both feet in the dry blanket from the chest beside the hearth and reached for her coat. "I need to open your coat," he said. "Check your temperature. Make sure you're not." He stopped. "Just need to check." Kept his hands to the task and nothing else. The coat was cheap and thin, soaked straight through, useless as paper in weather like this. Under it, a dress that wasn't much better. Under that, another layer, a man's flannel shirt that didn't belong to her. He noted it and said nothing. He noted the bruising at her collarbone, too, old enough to have turned yellow at the edges. He said nothing about that either. What he noticed most was her hands. Even unconscious, even half-frozen, she had both arms pulled in tight to her chest. He had to ease her hands apart gently to get the coat the rest of the way off. And that was when he saw it. A ledger. Scorched leather, the corners burned away, the cover warped from heat and then cold. She'd been holding it to her chest like it was a child. like it was the only thing in the world worth keeping warm. He looked at it for a long moment. Didn't touch it. Put it on the floor beside her where she'd be able to see it when she woke up. Then he covered her with 2 dry blankets, tucked them in close without pulling them tight, and went to heat water. He worked steadily and without noise. That was his way. He'd learned it in the cavalry, where panic was a luxury no one could afford, and he'd kept it after, on the ranch alone. Move through the problem. Deal with what's in front of you. He warmed water and dampened a cloth and cleaned the cut along her hairline shallow, already clotted. Nothing that needed closing. He watched her breathing even out, slow and shallow, and then, gradually, deepen. Color started to come back to her face. Not much, but some. He pulled a chair close to the fire and sat with his elbows on his knees, watching her breathe, the storm throwing itself against the walls of the cabin, like it had a grudge. Around midnight, her eyes opened. She moved fast, that was the first thing. No slow waking up, no confusion. She went from still to sitting upright in one sharp motion, and her hand shot out and grabbed the ledger off the floor before she'd even fully focused her eyes. She pulled it against herself and looked at him with the flat, measuring stare of an animal, deciding whether to bolt or fight. He didn't move, kept his hands visible, rested on his knees. "You're safe," he said. Not loud, even. "You're in my cabin. There's no one else here." She didn't say anything. Her eyes moved around the room, the door, the windows, back to him, cataloging exits. He recognized, too, from the war, from men who'd been in places where every room might be the last room. "There's food," he said. "When you're ready, no rush." She looked at him for a long time. "What do you want?" Her voice came out, cracked and dry. "Nothing." He stood slowly, giving her time to track the movement, and walked to the stove. "Just for you to get warm." He brought her a tin cup of broth. He set it on the floor in front of her, rather than handing it directly, and stepped back to give her space to reach it herself. She watched him do it. Something shifted in her eyes, not trust, not yet, but a slight easing of the sharpest edge of her fear. She picked up the cup and drank. He went back to his chair and let the silence sit. Outside, the storm howled and pressed. Inside, the fire popped and settled. "Clara," she said finally. "My name is Clara." It wasn't her name. He was nearly certain of that. He'd been around enough people with things to hide to know a borrowed name when he heard one. But a name was a name. It was what she wanted him to call her, and that was her right. "Harlan," he said. She nodded once. Her grip on the ledger had not loosened by a single degree. He watched her and thought about what it would take for a person to be walking through a blizzard in the Montana mountains in the dead of winter, with nothing but a burned ledger and stolen clothes and blood on her that wasn't hers. He thought about the bruising he'd seen at her collarbone. He thought about that borrowed flannel shirt. He thought about his sister. Then he stopped thinking about his sister, because that road went nowhere useful. He got up and added another log to the fire instead. "Sleep if you can," he said. "I'll be in the chair." "I won't come near you." She didn't respond, but a few minutes later her eyes closed. Her grip on the ledger stayed firm even as her breathing evened out. Harlan settled back in the chair, rifle within reach out of habit, and listened to the storm do its worst against the walls. He didn't sleep. He wasn't sure she was safe yet. And until he was sure, he'd stay awake. That was all there was to it. The storm took 3 days to die. 3 days of white, nothing outside the windows, of wind that made the cabin walls creak and moan like a ship at sea, of cold so complete it pressed in around the doorframe and left a rime of frost on the inside of the glass. 3 days of Harlan and the woman who called herself Clara, and the heavy silence between them. He didn't push. That was the thing she seemed most braced for, that he would push. Ask questions, demand an accounting of who she was, and how she'd gotten there, and what was in the ledger she slept with, pressed against her chest every single night. He saw her waiting for it. He saw how she tensed whenever he crossed the room, how her eyes tracked the distance between herself and the door, how she ate fast and without pleasure, like a person who'd learned not to expect a meal to last. So he gave her space. He gave her silence. He moved around his own cabin in a wide, predictable arc, always in her line of sight, always doing something ordinary, feeding the stove, sharpening a blade, mending the strap on a bridle. Ordinary things, nothing that required anything from her. By the second day, she stopped flinching when he stood up. By the third day, she started watching him with something other than pure wariness. Still guarded, still measuring. But there was a question forming behind her eyes that wasn't about escape routes anymore. The morning the storm broke, she woke before he did and stoked the fire herself. He came out of the back room to the smell of coffee already heating on the stove and found her standing at the window looking out at the world that had gone absolutely brilliantly white. The ledger was under her arm. The morning light caught the side of her face, and for just a moment she looked less like a hunted thing and more like a person. Still thin, still pale, but standing straight, both feet planted firm on the floor, like she was reminding herself how to do it. Snow stopped, she said without turning around. Happens eventually. He poured himself a cup of coffee and stood at the far end of the window. Outside, the mountains rose clean and massive against a sky that had gone hard blue. Roads will be buried for another week, maybe more. She absorbed that. Her jaw tightened slightly, but she didn't argue with the weather. I'll need to earn my keep, she said. You don't owe me anything. I didn't ask about owing. She turned to look at him directly. Her eyes were a dark, serious brown, and they had the quality of someone who was used to meaning what they said. I'm not built for sitting idle. Tell me what needs doing. He thought about it. The honest answer was that there was plenty to do. There always was on a ranch through winter. Feed to haul, stalls to muck, tack to mend, firewood to split. Work that didn't require conversation. Can you keep accounts? He asked. A small pause. I beg your pardon? Ledgers. Figures. I've got 3 months of feed costs and supply orders in a pile on the desk that I haven't touched because I hate numbers. He nodded toward the roll-top desk in the corner, which was, in fact, buried under a truly impressive accumulation of paper. My mare's due to foal in the spring. I need to know what I'm spending before I can figure what I can afford for the new season. She looked at the desk. She looked back at him. You're asking me to do your books, she said, if you're willing. I'm not asking you to cook or clean or do anything else. I've managed that myself for 4 years. I'll keep managing. But the accounts? He shrugged. I'd genuinely appreciate the help. Something moved across her face. It was a complicated expression, and it came and went quickly, but he caught it. It wasn't quite surprise, more like the shock of being seen in a way she hadn't expected, of being offered something that matched who she actually was, rather than what she looked like. All right, she said. I can do that. She sat down at the desk that same afternoon, and within an hour he could hear the quiet scratch of her pencil and the neat, small sound of figures being tallied. He went out to the barn and worked the horses, and didn't interrupt her. When he came back in at dusk, stomping snow from his boots, she had the pile of papers organized into 3 separate stacks and a column of numbers running down a clean sheet in a hand, so precise it looked nearly printed. You paid too much for the November oats, she said, without looking up. The merchant in Billings charges 30 cents less per bushel than whoever you've been buying from locally, over a winter season that's almost $4 in difference. He hung up his coat. How do you know the Billings price? I've seen the merchant's posted rates. I used to. She stopped, reset. I did some work involving supply accounting. Before. That single word, carrying everything she wasn't saying yet. I'll switch to Billings in the spring, he said. Write it in the margin so I remember. He watched her write it without hesitation, her pencil moving sure and quick. No second guessing, no glancing at him for approval. She just did it, because it was the right note to make, and she knew her own judgment was sound. There were men he'd served with who'd never managed that kind of confidence. He didn't say so. He went and made supper. They ate across the table from each other for the first time. Before, she'd taken her food to the chair by the fire, kept her back to a wall, kept her distance. Tonight, she sat at the table and ate the whole bowl of stew without stopping. She still had the ledger propped against the table leg where she could see it. He pretended not to notice. "The frostbite is healing," he said. "Yes. Any pain?" "Some. It's manageable." He nodded. They ate. "The cut on your head isn't from he said. "Not an accusation. Just a statement." She set her spoon down and looked at him steadily. "No, it isn't. You don't have to tell me anything." "I know." She picked her spoon back up. "I appreciate that." They cleared the table, and she went back to the accounts, and he read by the fire, and that was the evening. It was a quiet, careful thing. Two people in a small space, learning the shape of each other's edges without pressing on them. Outside, the cold settled back in, deep and absolute. Inside, the stove ticked and the lamp burned low, and the pages rustled softly in the corner. He slept well that night for the first time in days. He wasn't sure why. Maybe just the knowledge that there was another person breathing in the next room, that the cabin wasn't quite so empty as it had been before. In the morning, she was at the desk again, before he'd finished his first cup of coffee. The ledger, her ledger, was tucked under the desk where she could feel it with her foot. His accounts were spread in front of her. "You're short on winter barley," she said. "And if your mare foals in April like you expect, you'll need to increase your hay by at least good morning," he said. She stopped, looked up. For a moment she was perfectly still, and then something released in her expression, not quite a smile, but the shape of one, a softening around the eyes. "Good morning," she said. "You're short on winter barley." He laughed. It surprised him the way it just came out. He hadn't laughed in a while. "I'll make a note," he said, and poured her a cup of coffee without asking, and set it at the corner of the desk where she could reach it. She wrapped both hands around it and bent her head back to the figures. He watched her for a moment. This woman, this not Clara, sitting in his chair at his desk, pencil moving quick and certain, making sense of the chaos he'd let pile up for Thor. 3 months. Smart. Competent. Completely at home in the work. In a way that told him this wasn't a skill she'd picked up incidentally. This was the core of her. He went out to feed the horses and thought about what it would take to make a person feel like they had to borrow a name. Whatever it was something he recognized. The needing to be someone else for a while. The needing to let the person you actually were rest somewhere safe while you figured out if the world was going to let you survive. He'd done it himself after the cavalry, after his sister. He picked up a pitchfork and got to work and didn't think about his sister anymore. Over the following days, a rhythm developed between them. Not friendship, not yet, but something adjacent to it. A functional warmth. She finished his accounts and started a proper record system, labeling each category, building a running tally that would take him through the next fiscal year. He fixed the loose shutter that had been banging for a month and rechinked the gap in the north wall where the cold was getting in worst. She noted it in the maintenance record she'd started keeping without being asked. He didn't question it. He just noticed it with something like quiet gratitude. She started sleeping without the ledger against her chest. She still kept it close on the chair beside the bed, or tucked under the edge of the mattress where she could touch it. But she was sleeping deeper, and he knew because he could hear her breathe. When he passed the door in the mornings, slow and even rather than the shallow, watch every sound sleep she'd been doing those first days. He figured that was a good sign. He didn't ask her real name. He called her Clara, and she answered to it, and they both understood the agreement without having to put words to it. The truth would come out when she was ready. Not before. That was how it worked, with people who'd been broken and were trying to decide if they could still be trusted with their own story. You waited. You gave them a desk and a cup of coffee and work that matched their ability, and you waited. And slowly the ghosts started to quiet down. The roof went on a Tuesday. Harlan heard it first, a sound like a cannon shot overhead, A crack so sharp and sudden it brought him up out of a dead sleep, with his hand reaching for the rifle before his eyes were even open. Then came the groan of timber under impossible weight, long and deep and grinding, and then a second crack, and then the whole north section of the barn roof gave way in one catastrophic collapse. He was dressed and out the door in under a minute. The cold hit him like a fist. The sky was still black, just starting to go gray at the eastern edge, and the stars were hard and sharp overhead. He ran across the yard toward the barn, and the noise coming from inside was bad hooves drumming on wood, horses squealing, that high panicked pitch that meant something was very, very wrong. He threw open the barn door. The north end of the roof had come down in a single section, timbers and snow and shingles folded in on itself and dropped straight into the two northernmost stalls. His gelding was in one of those stalls. He couldn't see him through the dust and debris. He didn't stop moving. He got to the fallen timber first and put his shoulder against it, heaving with everything he had. It shifted an inch. He heard the gelding alive. Good. Panicked, but alive. And he reset his feet and shoved again, and got enough clearance to get the stall door open and drag the horse out by the halter, talking low and fast the whole time, not full sentences, just sound, just his voice. Steady. Here. You're all right. Come on. He got the gelding to the far end of the barn and tied him, got his mare who was in the south end and untouched, but absolutely convinced she was dying settled next to him. Went back and checked the other horses one by one, every stall, every animal, running his hands along their legs, checking for cuts from the debris, checking eyes and breathing. He was on his knees in the third stall, checking a hind leg, when he heard the second crack. Not from the roof this time. From above him, directly above him, a single timber that had been resting at an angle against the standing section of the wall, balanced, held in place by nothing more than the packed snow against the outside of the barn. And then the snow shifted, and the balance went, and the timber fell. He had just enough time to turn his head. It caught him across the upper thigh and took him down hard. The stall wall stopped him from going completely flat, but he hit it with his shoulder and dropped onto one knee. And the pain came in a wave so big he heard himself make a sound he didn't recognize. He gripped the wall and held on and breathed through it, and when the first wave passed, he looked down. The timber had a split-end, jagged, splintered wood, but with a piece of old barn metal twisted around it, a strip of iron from the original construction. And that strip of iron was in his leg, not deep, but deep enough. He could see the dark stain spreading through his trouser leg already, black in the dim light, moving fast. He reached for it. His hand shook. He stopped reaching. If he pulled it out here, alone, on his knees in a cold barn, he was going to bleed, and he was going to pass out, and he was going to die in the straw. He knew enough about wounds to know that. He grabbed the broken post beside him and hauled himself upright. The leg took his weight, barely. He got his arm against the wall and started moving. The walk across the yard to the cabin was the longest walk of his life. He made it. He got the door open and stumbled inside and caught himself on the table edge, and the sound he made when his leg took that jolt was enough to bring her out of the back room at a dead run, dark hair loose, eyes wide and alert. She took one look at him and one look at the leg, and her face went the color of chalk. "Sit down," she said. "I need." "Sit down." She was already at the stove, already swinging the kettle over the heat. Her voice was steady in a way her face wasn't quite. How deep? Metal in the muscle, not at the bone. He got himself onto the bench and gripped the table edge. "I need you to get it out." She turned and looked at him. "I can't get it out myself," he said. "Angle's wrong, and I'll lose consciousness if I push on it wrong. I need you to heat a knife on the hearth, small blade. There's a kit in the top drawer of the chest, under the window. Needle and thread in it, and carbolic." She opened the drawer, found the kit. She moved well under pressure, fast and efficient, without the stuttering paralysis some people fell into in a crisis. She got the small blade out and set it directly on the grate in the hearth, handle out so she could grab it, and then she came back to him and knelt in front of his leg. "Tell me what I'm looking at," she said. He told her the angle of the metal, what she'd need to do to open the wound enough to get underneath it, where to apply pressure afterward. He kept his voice flat and informational, the same voice he used to give orders, back when giving orders was his job. She listened without interrupting, without flinching, and when he finished, she sat back on her heels and said nothing for a moment. He watched her face. Something was happening in her eyes, something that had nothing to do with him. She was somewhere else, for just a moment, not gone, not vacant, but pressed against something heavy inside herself that he couldn't see. Her hands, which had been steady up to that point, started to shake. He knew what a dissociation looked like. He'd seen it in men after battle. He'd felt it himself, standing over his sister in that farmhouse doorway, unable to make his legs move, unable to make any part of himself do what the situation required. She was gripping her own wrist with her opposite hand, pressing hard, like she was trying to hold herself together by force of will alone. "Hey," his voice dropped. "Look at me." She looked at him. "The knife," he said. "I need you to get the knife. It's ready." She stood. She crossed to the hearth. He saw her stop in front of the fire, the handle within reach, and he saw the moment she recognized what she was being asked to hold, what it meant to hold it. Her hand hovered over it, not quite touching. He would learn later what the knife meant. He didn't know yet. But he could see that it was costing her something enormous just to close her fingers around the handle. She picked it up. She turned around. She crossed the room and knelt in front of him again, and her hands were shaking visibly, badly, and her eyes were bright with tears she was refusing to let fall. And she pressed her lips together and looked at the wound and looked at the blade and drew a slow breath in through her nose. "I have to cut you," she said, "to get underneath it." "Yes," another breath. Her hands weren't steadying. The knife trembled. "I can't." Her voice broke slightly. What if the pain? Look at me." He reached out and gripped her wrist. Not the knife hand, the other one. His grip was firm, and he held her eyes with his. She met them, and he could see how hard she was fighting, and he didn't look away from her. "Not for a second. You are the only person in this room who can do this, and you can do it. But I need you to go deeper than you think. Don't stop when I flinch. Don't stop at the blood. You hear me?" Her jaw was shaking. Her eyes were too bright. "You're almost there already," he gritted out. "Deeper. Don't stop." Something shifted in her face. Not calm, nothing as easy as calm. Something harder than calm. A decision. The same kind of decision that got made in a single second and couldn't be unmade. She pressed her lips together until they went white, and she looked down at the wound, and she did it. He did flinch. He couldn't help it. His whole body went rigid, and he gripped the edge of the table, hard enough to leave marks, and he heard himself make a sound through locked teeth, and she did not stop. Her hands steadied the moment. The blade bit in the trembling stopped, as if the act of committing had burned it off entirely, and she worked with a precise, terrible care that was better than some field surgeons he'd known. Fast where speed mattered. Steady where steadiness mattered. The metal came out in one piece. She sat back. She was covered in his blood, her hands, her wrists, the front of her shirt. She was breathing in short, shallow bursts, and her eyes were fixed on the strip of iron she'd set on the floor beside her, like she was making sure it was real, like she was making sure she'd actually done it. He grabbed the cloth from the kit with both hands and pressed it to the wound before she had to think about that next step. "Carbolic," he said, "and then you'll need to close it." She blinked, refocused. She found the carbolic, and she helped him with the cloth, and she threaded the needle with hands that only shook a little now, and she closed the wound with 7 tight, even stitches that she tied off herself. When she was done, she sat back on her heels and put both hands flat on her thighs and looked at them. He watched her breathe. He looked at her hands, blood-covered, completely still, now unwavering. He thought about the shaking that had come before and what it would take to push through that kind of shaking. What it would take to hold a blade when every part of you was telling you not to, when the blade meant something other than what the moment needed. He thought about what she'd survived to be sitting in this room. He didn't know the specifics yet, but a person moved through the world a certain way when they had been beaten down to nothing and had found their way back from it anyway. A person's hands told you things. Her hands had told him everything. This woman was not what she appeared. Not a victim, not a fugitive, not a fragile thing the winter had nearly finished. She was something that had been tested in the worst possible way and had come out the other side still intact. Bent, maybe. Carrying the weight of it. Absolutely. But intact, whole, made of something that didn't break clean. He looked down at her blood-soaked, unwavering hands, and he understood the truth with a certainty that had nothing to do with what she'd told him, which was almost nothing and everything to do with what he had just seen. This was not a helpless woman. This was a survivor, the kind that got forged in fire, in the worst that human beings could do to each other, and came out the other side still standing, still moving forward, still choosing in the hardest moment to reach for the blade instead of away from it. "You did it," he said quietly. She looked up at him. Her eyes were dry now. She'd fought back the tears somewhere in the middle of the stitching, and they hadn't come back. "You told me not to stop," she said. "You didn't?" She exhaled one long, slow breath that seemed to carry something out of her as it went. Then she began quietly cleaning up, gathering the cloths and the kit, rising to rinse her hands at the basin. Every movement careful, methodical, like she was reassembling herself from the inside out, piece by piece, and she needed to do it alone. He let her. He sat with his bandaged legs stretched out in front of him, and the fire burning, and the gray winter light growing in the windows. And he thought that he had never in his life been so wrong about the weight of a person. He had carried her in from the snow thinking she needed saving. He was only now beginning to understand that she had been saving herself long before he came along. The leg kept him off it for 4 days. Harlan was a bad patient. He admitted this freely. He lasted about 6 hours in the chair before he was trying to stand, and Joe, he didn't know her real name yet, but he'd started thinking of her as something other than Clara in his head, something with more weight to it, told him to sit back down in a voice that left no room for argument. He sat back down. She brought him food and changed the dressing without being asked and without making a production of it. And she kept the accounts and kept the fire, and in the evenings she read from the single shelf of books he owned, sometimes aloud, if the passage was worth it. He had a Bible, 2 volumes of frontier law, a battered copy of David Copperfield, and a surveyor's manual that he'd bought by mistake and never returned. She read from Dickens. She had a good reading voice, low and even, with a rhythm to it that told him she'd read aloud to people before. To children, maybe. He noticed her pause once in the middle of a passage and press her lips together. She moved on quickly. He didn't remark on it. On the 4th day, he started moving around with a stick for support because the horses needed more than she could manage alone, and he'd be damned before he let them suffer for his inconvenience. She didn't argue. She just walked beside him to the barn and held the lantern while he worked, and handed him things before he had to ask for them, and caught him once when his leg buckled without comment and without fuss. That evening, they sat on opposite sides of the fire after supper. The ledger was on the table between them. Her ledger. She'd been moving it less. It still followed her from room to room, but she set it down now sometimes, left it on the table while she worked at the desk, while she cooked. It was still the first thing she reached for in the morning, and the last thing she checked at night. But the feverish grip of those first days had loosened somewhat. Harlan looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at her. "You don't have to tell me," he said. "Whatever's in it, whatever happened, I'm not asking." She was quiet for a long time. The fire popped once, loud in the silence. "I know you're not," she said. Another silence. He picked up his coffee cup and found it empty and set it back down. "My name is Josephine," she said. "Josephine Mercer. People call me Joe. Let's sit for a moment. Joe, he said. I was a school teacher. In a town about 60 miles east of here, she kept her eyes on the fire. Her voice was steady in the way that required work to make it steady. He recognized that, too. I taught reading and arithmetic and some geography. I had a good post. A clean room above the hardware store. Enough to live on. She paused. I was saving to open my own school. Eventually, I had a plan. He didn't say anything. Reverend Malachi Stone ran the church there. He runs most things in that town, or close to it. He has the ear of the mayor, the county judge, the land office. Men bring their disputes to him before they bring them to the law. He gives to the poor publicly and charges for it privately. She stopped. I didn't understand what he was. At first, he was charming, educated. He seemed to care about the people in his congregation. Harlan's hand tightened slightly around his empty cup. He kept very still. He assaulted me, Joe said. Flat, direct. No softening of it. No reaching for a gentler word. Just the truth stated plain. And when there were consequences from that, he didn't let me leave. He kept me in his house. He told the town I was unwell. He told people I'd had a breakdown, that he was ministering to me out of Christian charity. Her jaw shifted. He was waiting. For what? Harlan said, though he was beginning to understand. For the baby. The word dropped into the room and stayed there. He had an arrangement, Joe said, with brokers on the East Coast. Wealthy families who wanted children and didn't ask too many questions about where they came from. He'd done it before. The ledger, she reached out and put her hand flat on the cover of it. He documented everything. Names, dates, money paid, families who received children. He was careful about it. He said it was because God required accounting for all things. Her voice went very quiet. I think it was because he liked having proof of what he'd done. I think he liked the record of it. Harlan looked at her hand on the ledger. My daughter was born in October, Joe said. He took her the same night. I held her for. She stopped, started again. He told me she had died. He had a whole story prepared. He cried in church the following Sunday about the tragic loss, the poor, mad woman he'd been harboring who'd brought a dead child into the world. Her fingers pressed flat on the leather, but I had heard her cry. Before they took her from the room, she cried. She was alive. The fire burned. Outside, the wind moved through the pines. I waited, Joe said. I had nothing. No weapon, no proof, no one who would believe me over him. So I waited and I watched, and I learned where he kept the ledger, and I found a way to get to it. And when the moment came, I took it. And then I went into his study, and I took the ledger, and I burned every other paper I could find in that room. And when he came in and found me, She stopped again. You defended yourself, Harlan said. I stabbed him. Still direct. Still flat. Not mortally. He was alive and screaming when I ran. She looked up at Harlan for the first time since she'd started talking. He has connections to the territorial bounty system. He'll have used them by now. That's why I was running. I knew he'd. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Harlan set down his cup very deliberately. He stood up, one hand on the table for balance, and walked to the window. He stood there with his back to her and breathed. In and out. Slow. He was furious. Not at her. The fury was enormous and structural, aimed at something much larger than one corrupt man in one corrupt town, at a system that had let all of it happen. That gave men like Malachi Stone authority over women, over children, over the law itself. That had given his sister's husband the same authority 20 years ago, and had given Harlan exactly nothing to stand behind when he tried to stop what was happening. He turned back around. Their laws treat women as property and steal their motherhood, he said. His voice came out rough. He didn't try to smooth it. That's what they've built. A system that calls itself Christian and calls itself just and gives men like him a collar and a pulpit to hide behind while he does. He stopped, pressed his knuckles against the table. But on this land, you are a free human being with a right to life and justice, and we will make them pay. Joe looked at him, not with surprise, exactly, more with the expression of someone who had braced so long for the opposite reaction, the dismissal, The doubt, the careful distancing, that the absence of it took a moment to process. The ledger, Harlan said. It names them all. The families, the brokers, the payments. Yes. And you know where your daughter was sent? There are adoption papers in his study. I didn't have time to get them. But the ledger has the broker's name and the date and the amount paid. If we can get to someone with the authority to act on it, the governor, Harlan said. Territorial governor in Helena. He's been trying to crack Malachi's operation for 2 years. Everybody knows Malachi's dirty, but nobody's been able to get proof in a form that holds in a court. He looked at the ledger. That is proof. That is more than proof. That's a full accounting in his own hand. Joe stared at him. You know about him? I've heard things. Men talk in trading posts. I've heard about children going missing from that county, and I've heard Malachi Stone's name alongside it, and I've heard nothing ever came of it, because nobody could pin evidence to him. He met her eyes. You have the evidence. The silence that followed was different from the silences before it. This one had direction to it, purpose. The roads, Joe said. Another few weeks before they're passable. He looked at her steadily. You're safe here until then. He doesn't know where you ended up, and nobody's going to ride up into these mountains until the spring thaw starts. She nodded slowly. Her hand was still on the ledger, but the pressure of it had changed less defensive, more deliberate, like she was holding something she intended to use, rather than something she was protecting from being taken. He stole her, Joe said, not loud. Almost to herself, he built a business out of stealing children from the mothers who bore them, and the law let him do it because the law doesn't consider us. She stopped. We're not people to them. We're vessels. We're property that produces property. That's what they made, Harlan said. It's not what's right. She looked at him. I know the difference, he said, between what a law says and what's right. I learned it the hard way. He didn't explain that. He wasn't ready to explain that, but he said it, and he meant it, and he could tell by her face that she heard the truth in it. My daughter's name is Clara, Joe said. That's why I used it when you asked. Her voice dropped slightly. I don't know if whoever has her kept the name, but that's what I called her. Those few hours I had with her, Clara. Harlan nodded. The name settled in the room between them, small and real. We'll find her, he said. He said it the way he'd made promises in the cavalry, not lightly, not performatively, but because he meant it, and because once he said a thing, he followed through. You have my word on that. Joe held his gaze for a long moment. Then she looked back at the ledger, and her expression was no longer the expression of a woman who was running. It was the expression of a woman who had decided to stop. The thaw started slow. It came in pieces, a day of softer air, then a cold snap, then 2 days of weak sun that turned the top layer of snow to slush before the temperature dropped overnight and froze it to a crust. The mountains shed snow in periodic avalanches that rumbled through the valley like distant cannon fire. The creek rose. The road south, which Harlan could see as a faint depression through the trees from his upper pasture fence, started to show dark patches of mud between the white. Another week, maybe 2, and it would be passable. He'd started thinking seriously about Helena, about what the route looked like, what kind of time it would take on horseback, whether to go around Dead Man's Pass or through it. Through was faster by half a day. Around was safer, and added 6 miles of climbing. He was still turning it over when the stranger rode up the track on a Thursday morning. Harlan saw him first. He was mending the fence along the upper pasture when the rider came through the tree line, and something about the horse made him stop what he was doing. It wasn't a ranch horse or a traveler's horse. It was a working animal, well-muscled, even-tempered, trained. Stand quiet, the rider moved with the relaxed posture of a man who spent most of his life in the saddle, and none of it worrying about the return trip. Harlan leaned the fence post against the wire and walked down to the yard. He reached the cabin before the rider got to the gate, and he stepped up onto the porch without hurrying, and when he heard the door behind him start to open, he said, without turning, "Stay inside." The door paused, then it clicked shut. The rider came through the gate. He was big-wide, through the shoulders somewhere in his 40s, with a face that had been weathered past handsome and settled into something harder. He wore a duster coat over a dark suit. No badge. The absence of a badge was its own kind of statement. He stopped his horse 20 feet out. "Morning," he said, looking for the Cross Ranch. "You found it," Harlan said. "You Harlan Cross? Depends on what you need him for." The rider smiled. It didn't do much to warm his face. "Name's Gideon Locke. I'm looking for a woman. Young, dark hair, about so tall." He indicated with his hand. "Might be going by a false name. She's wanted in connection with an assault on a man of God down in Caldwell County. Theft, destruction of property, assault with a deadly weapon." He let each a charge separately, like he was reading from a docket. "Reward's good." Thought, maybe someone might have come through here during the storms. Harlan looked at him for a moment. The rifle was just inside the door. He'd put it there this morning out of habit, the same as every morning, 6 steps from where he was standing. "Nobody came through here," Harlan said. "Nobody," Gideon repeated. "Road's been buried since December. You're the first person I've seen since November." He kept his voice completely even. "Come a long way for nothing, Mr. Locke." Gideon looked at the yard. He looked at the cabin. He looked at the barn, which still showed the repaired section of the roof, the new timber pale against the weathered wood. He looked at the snow in the yard, the paths worn into it between cabin and barn and woodpile, the kind of paths one person made over months. His eyes moved across the 2 sets of prints between the porch and the woodpile. He looked back at Harlan. "Mind if I water my horse?" he said. "Tross outside the gate," Harlan said, "where you just came from." A pause. The 2 men looked at each other. "I'll be back this way in a week or 2, Gideon said pleasantly, "when the roads open up, in case your memory improves." "It won't," Harlan said. "Safe travels." Gideon held his gaze for another 3 seconds. Then he turned his horse and rode back out through the gate at an easy walk, not hurrying, not looking back. A man who had no doubt he'd accomplish what he'd come for, one way or another, just a matter of timing. Harlan watched him ride through the trees and disappear. Then he went inside. Jo was standing in the middle of the room. She'd heard enough through the door. Her face was the controlled blank kind that people got when the fear was too big to show on the outside. "Gideon Locke," she said. "You know the name. He's a bounty hunter. Malachi uses him for things he needs done quietly." She stopped. "He's not trying to bring me back for trial. There won't be a trial. Malachi can't afford a trial. Not with the ledger out there." Her eyes went to the ledger on the table. "He wants me dead and the ledger destroyed." Harlan crossed to the chest under the window. He opened it and lifted out the Winchester. He checked the action, checked the load, laid it on the table. "He'll come back," Harlan said. "Yes, with more men, probably. Yes." He looked at her. She was still watching the rifle with an expression he couldn't read from one angle. "Come outside." She looked at him. "I'm going to teach you to shoot." He picked up the Winchester and held it out. "And I want to start today." They went to the far end of the property, where the tree line started, and a natural rise in the ground gave them a backstop. Harlan set up 3 cans on the fence post he'd been working on that morning and walked back to where Jo was standing in the snow. He held out the Winchester. She took it. It was heavier than she'd expected, he could tell by the way she adjusted her arms. She held it carefully, not wrong exactly, but unpracticed, like something she'd been told was dangerous, and had kept at arm's length accordingly. "Right," he said. "First thing, the rifle doesn't care about your size or your strength. It cares about your aim and your steadiness. That's it. The mechanics do the rest." He moved alongside her, not behind her, not crowding her. "Stock against your shoulder. Not the top of your arm against the shoulder itself, in the pocket there. That's where it absorbs the kick," she adjusted. He watched without touching. "Good. Now your cheek down against the stock. You're looking along the barrel, not above it. The front sight and the rear notch, line them up, put your target in the center." She looked down the barrel. Her head tipped slightly. "There," he said. "Now breathe slow. You want to pull the trigger at the bottom of your exhale when your body is calmest. Don't jerk it. Squeeze." She squared her feet and breathed, and the shot went off. The leftmost can went sideways off the post. She startled at the report. Her whole body flinched back slightly from the sound and the kick, and then she stood very still for a moment, and he could see her reorienting, figuring out what had just happened. "You hit it," he said. She lowered the rifle slightly and looked at the gap where the can had been. "First best shot," he said. "Most people take a dozen to start making contact." She looked at him. "Do it again," she said. They stayed out there for the better part of 2 hours. By the end of it, she had taken out 7 of the 9 targets he'd set up, and the 2 she missed were close, the shots going wide, only by a matter of inches. The flinch before trigger pull, still coming now and then, when she hadn't fully cleared the breath first. He corrected it once, showed her the difference in body position between a gripped breath and a released one, and she applied it immediately and didn't make the mistake a third time. She learned fast. Not just the mechanics, she seemed to understand the underlying logic of it, the geometry of aim and distance and breath, and she worked it out in her head and then applied it. He didn't have to explain anything twice. He reset the last 2 cans and watched her clear them both in quick succession. She lowered the rifle and stood there, breathing the cold air, and there was something on her face he'd been watching build over the last hour. It wasn't triumph exactly, more like recognition. Something returning to her that had been taken. "A man might have brute muscle," Harlan said, "but this Winchester doesn't care if you're a man or a woman." She turned and looked at him, and he held her gaze. "Out here in the wild, it gives you absolute equality." She was quiet for a moment. She looked back at the fence post where the cans had been. "My whole life," she said, "I was taught to be small, take up less space, ask less, want less, be grateful for less." She turned the rifle over in her hands, looking at it, not because it was right, because they needed me to believe it was inevitable. "It's not," Harlan said. "No." She looked up at him. "It's not." They walked back toward the cabin, through snow that had started to soften in the afternoon sun, the Winchester over her arm in the crook of her elbow, comfortable now, already more natural than it had been at the start of the afternoon. They practiced every day after that. Morning chores, accounts, the ongoing work of the ranch, and then, in the hour before the light went, target practice. She got faster, and she got steadier, and she stopped flinching at the report entirely by the end of the first week. She learned how to load and clear and maintain the weapon. Harlan showed her how to check the barrel, how to clean the action, how to handle a misfire safely and without panic. She absorbed every part of it with the same focused attention she'd brought to his financial ledgers, complete, methodical, leaving nothing half-learned. Locke didn't come back that week. But the spring thaw was accelerating. The road was more mud than ice now, on the south-facing sections. Another few days, and they could ride on the last evening before they planned to leave. For Helena, Joe sat at the desk, going over the route. Harlan had sketched on a piece of paper. Distances, landmarks, the pass, and its alternative. She'd asked him to write it out, so she could understand the whole shape of what they were riding into, not just the first leg of it. He sat by the fire and watched her work, and thought about Gideon Locke's eyes moving over the 2 sets of tracks in the snow. The man would be back, and he wouldn't be alone. Joe set down the paper and picked up the Winchester, which was leaning against the desk within arm's reach. She checked the load smooth and automatic now, barely a pause, and set it back. She looked across the room at Harlan. "If something happens out there," she said, "at the pass or on the road, I need you to know that I will not freeze." She said it simply. No bravado in it. Just a statement of fact made by someone who had tested the claim and trusted the result. "I know what I'm capable of now. I won't freeze." He believed her. He believed her because he'd watched her stand in this yard for 2 hours in 20-degree cold and put round after round into targets, and not once had she stopped because it was hard or cold or uncomfortable, because the only time she'd come close to faltering was when she'd had a knife in her hand in a dim cabin and a dying man on the floor in front of her. And she hadn't frozen then either. "I know," he said. She nodded once and turned back to the route map. He stoked the fire and listened to the creek running high outside, louder than it had been even yesterday, and he thought about what waited for them down that mountain road. Malachi's reach was long. Gideon Locke was good at what he did. Dead Man's Pass was narrow and had no cover worth speaking of for the last quarter mile before the canyon. It was going to be dangerous. He looked at Joe, bent over the map, the Winchester at her elbow, planning the route in her precise and methodical way, missing nothing, preparing for contingencies. Dangerous, he thought. But they weren't going into it alone. They left before dawn. The air was sharp and still, the kind of cold that had lost its killing edge, but hadn't yet made peace with spring. Their breath rose in small clouds. The horses moved quiet through the dark, hooves soft in the mud and slush of the track, and neither Harlan nor Joe spoke until the ranch had disappeared behind the first ridge. He'd packed light, ammunition, food for 4 days, a bedroll each, the carbolic, and bandages, because he believed in those more than luck. The ledger was wrapped in oilskin and tucked inside Joe's coat, against her body. They'd discussed it the night before and agreed without much argument that it stayed on her. If something happened to him on the road, she needed to be able to keep moving. She was on the mare, who was calm and trail smart. He was on the gelding. Both horses were fresh and moving well in the cool morning air. Dead Man's Pass was 6 hours out. He'd gone back and forth on the route one more time over breakfast, and the math kept coming out the same. The longer way around added a full day and took them through lower terrain that was actually more exposed to anyone watching the road from Caldwell County. The pass was higher and narrower, but it cut the journey to Helena by 8 hours and brought them out above the valley on the eastern approach, where the governor's office had men stationed since last fall, through the pass. That was the call. He hadn't told Joe about the unease sitting in his gut. She'd have pushed back on it, pointed out that unease wasn't intelligence, and that choosing a longer route based on a feeling was poor tactics. She would have been right. So he kept it to himself and watched the tree line as they rode. The morning opened up around them. The mountains turned gold, then white, then the particular blue-gray of full winter light. Crows called in the pines. A hawk circled the lower canyon. The road climbed steadily, following a frozen creek bed that had started to thaw at the edges, a thin thread of dark water showing through the ice. "Tell me about Helena," Joe said after a while. "Territorial capital, bigger than anything." In Caldwell County. He kept his eyes on the trail ahead. "The governor's name is Aldridge. He's got some sense in him, more than most. He's been trying to get a case built against Malachi for long enough that he'll know what the ledger means the minute he sees it. Will he believe me? He'll believe the ledger. It's in Malachi's hand, and the names in it are prominent enough that half of them can be verified inside of a week." He glanced at her. "Your job is to get the ledger into his hands. Once that happens, the evidence argues for itself." She nodded. Her hand went briefly to the front of her coat, checking the oilskin package. An unconscious gesture she made every hour or so. He'd stopped noticing and started noticing again. They reached the entrance to the pass at noon. The canyon walls rose on either side. Red and gray rocks stripped clean by wind, narrowing the trail to about 10 feet across at its widest point. The snow in the pass hadn't softened the way it had at lower elevation. It was still packed hard and boot-deep in the shadows, slick in the places where the sun had reached, and refrozen overnight. The horses slowed. Rock walls close like that made them nervous, something instinctive about the narrowing of space. Harlan felt the back of his neck go tight. He'd been through this pass a dozen times. He knew the quarter-mile stretch before the canyon opened out at the eastern end. The place where the walls came closest, and the trail bent slightly left around a rock shelf. You couldn't see past it until you were on it. He'd always thought, every time he made that bend, that a man with a rifle and any patience at all could stop a regiment in that spot. He slowed the gelding. "Stay close," he said quietly. "Other side of me when we hit the bend." Joe moved without asking why. She'd learned to trust his read of terrain the same way she'd learned everything else fast and completely. They were 30 yards from the bend when the first shot cracked off the canyon wall. The gelding went sideways, plunging, and Harlan grabbed his horn and got him under control in 2 hard strides. Go left, tight to the wall, and Joe was already moving, pushing hard to the left where the rock overhang gave them some cover. More shots, 3, 4, coming from the rock shelf above the bend. He got a look at the angles, 2 men up on the shelf, maybe a third further back. His rifle was out of the scabbard, and he was firing back on instinct. The gelding lunging underneath him. Not the kind of shooting he could put accuracy behind, but enough to make them pull back for a second. Joe was firing too. He registered it at the edge of his awareness. She'd gotten the Winchester up and was shooting from the mare's back with the flat, settled posture of a woman who had been doing this for 3 weeks and knew exactly how her body and the weapon moved together. The shot was controlled. The mare, to her credit, held. "We have to push through the bend," he shouted. "On my mark." "There are 3 of them," she shouted back. "I know, we go through or we're pinned. On my mark, ride hard and don't stop shooting." A pause. 1 beat. "Ready," she said. He went. He pushed the gelding forward and cut right, drawing fire, and Joe came left and through the gap at a flat run, the mare's hooves throwing ice chips, her rifle cracking twice in quick succession. He heard one of Locke's men shout whether hit or startled. He couldn't tell. He wheeled the gelding to follow Joe through the bend. The shot came from behind and to the right. It caught him across the ribs a graze. He could tell that immediately, a line of fire that didn't bury deep, but knocked the air from his lungs and took his left arm with it for a second. He lost his grip on the reins. The gelding, panicked now, took 3 huge lunging strides to the right before Harlan got his right hand back on the leather and pulled. The pull was too late. The edge of the trail at that section of the pass dropped off sharply to the left, where a flash melt channel had carved out the outer bank, and the gelding's left rear hoof hit mud instead of rock, and they went. Not a full fall, a violent, crashing slide down the bank, Harlan losing his seat and hitting the water first, the creek swallowing him in one cold, total shock. The gelding scrambled and found his feet and lunged back up the bank. Harlan went under. The creek was fast and deep from the thaw, and it was cold beyond any cold that had a name. He'd been in cold water before, but not like this. This was the kind of cold that stopped your limbs from obeying before your mind caught up to what was happening. He came up once, got half a breath, went under again. The current was pulling downstream, fast and purposeful, through the narrow cut of the canyon floor. He tried to swim. He managed something. He came up a second time on the near bank and got his arm over a root and held on. Above him, the shooting had stopped. He couldn't hear Joe. He held the root and breathed and tried to make his body work. And all he could think was that the shooting had stopped and he couldn't hear Joe, and the silence was the worst sound he'd ever encountered. Then from above and downstream, he heard horses moving fast, more than 2. And then nothing. He held on. He breathed. The cold went in deeper. When he found out what had happened on that trail, Joe knocked unconscious, bound to a horse, dragged back toward Caldwell County. He would learn it later from the marks in the snow and the testimony of a man who'd been at the wrong side of it. But for now, he held a root in a half-frozen creek with a grazed rib and lungs full of glacial water. And the world above him was completely silent. The chapter of his life in which he had come close to dying twice and called it a bad week wasn't over yet. It was only getting worse. Joe woke up in the dark. Not the dark of a room with a shuttered window or a cloudy night. The dark of somewhere intentional. The dark of a place that was meant to be dark, meant to be closed, meant to keep something in. She lay still for a moment and took stock. Her head was ringing a deep, low throb above her left ear, where something had connected with her on the trail. She remembered the blow, barely. A blur of movement and then nothing. Her wrists were bound behind her. Rope, not tight enough to cut circulation, but tight enough to mean business. Her ankles were free. She was lying on her side, on what felt like packed dirt, straw underneath her cheek. A barn. She could smell it. Horse and hay and old wood and cold. The particular smell of a working barn in winter that she'd come to know well over the past weeks. She made herself breathe. In through the nose, slow. Out through the mouth, slower. Malachi's barn. She'd been in it once, months ago, when she'd been allowed outside for the first time in weeks. She remembered the shape of it, long and low. 4 stalls on the east side, a hayloft above, a single door at the south end with a bar latch that required 2 hands and a specific angle to open from the inside. She wasn't going to open the door, not the main one. She sat up carefully. The ringing in her head peaked and then settled back. She stayed still until her vision cleared, then began a methodical assessment of her immediate situation, what she could reach, what she could see, what was within the radius of her bound hands. The oilskin package was gone. They'd taken the ledger. That fact landed with a weight that was almost physical. She sat with it for a moment, let herself feel the full force of it. Then she set it aside and moved on, because sitting with it any longer than a moment was a luxury she couldn't afford. The floor around her was dirt with straw scattered over it. Old straw, mostly, near her left hip. Her fingers found the edge of a rough board floor plank, she thought at first, but when she ran her bound fingers along it, the texture was wrong. Thinner. Uniform. A pallet board, maybe, or part of an old crate. She kept feeling. Her fingers moved in the straw methodically. She found the nail about 3 minutes in. It was large and old, the kind of cut nail that had been in this floor for 30 years, driven deep, and then worked loose over time until it sat proud by about 1/2 an inch, head still flat and firm. She couldn't pull it free. She didn't need to. What she needed was the exposed shank, and she had it. She positioned herself carefully, getting her bound wrists over the nail head, and started working the rope against it. It was slow. The nail was not sharp. The rope was not thin. She had to keep repositioning to keep the right friction, and her arms ached from being twisted behind her, and the work had to be done without sound, without movement that could be seen or heard from outside the barn. She thought about Harlan. She'd seen him go into the creek. She'd seen it from the back of the horse, being pulled forward by Locke's man, not able to stop or turn back or do anything, except watch over her shoulder, as the horse bolted with Harlan on it, and both of them disappeared off the trail's edge. She didn't know if he'd come up. She pressed the heel of her hand against the nail and worked the rope back and forth. She'd believed him when he said he was good in difficult terrain. She'd believed him when he'd told her, the night before they left, that he'd survived a winter campaign in the high Rockies during the war, and that his body knew how to take punishment and keep going. She believed in the evidence of what she'd watched him do: the fence he'd mended on a leg that was barely healed, the roof repair he'd managed with Joe, and a second-hand pulley system, the way he moved through hard physical work like it was simply a negotiation between his body and the task. She believed in him. But the creek had been fast, and the temperature had been killing, and believing in someone was not the same as certainty. She worked the rope. At some point in the middle of it, she'd lost track of time. It could have been an hour. It could have been more. She heard the door creak. She dropped flat into the straw and closed her eyes, lay completely still, breath even. Footsteps. One set, heavy boots. They paused, somewhere in the middle of the barn. She heard the strike of a match, and light bloomed red through her closed eyelids. Locke. She could hear him more than see him. A lamp being set on a hook, the sound of him pulling up a stool. "Know you're awake," he said. She didn't move. "Doesn't matter," he said. "You're not going anywhere. Tomorrow morning, you and I ride out to the old mill road, and there's an unfortunate accident. And Reverend Stone has a very sad prayer circle about it on Sunday. He let that sit in the air, so rest up. She kept her eyes closed. She kept breathing. He sat for a few more minutes. Then he stood up, unhooked the lamp, and walked back to the door. He didn't bother taking the lamp with him. He left her in the dark again. She counted to 200. Then she sat up and found the nail and started working again. She thought about what Harlan had told her in those weeks at the ranch. Not just about the rifle, though she ran through every lesson in her mind now, everything about stance and breath and not stopping when it was hard. She thought about the other things, the practical things, the things he said almost incidentally while they were doing something else. First rule in a bad situation, he'd said once, while they were repairing the barn roof together, and the wind had picked up and the timber they were trying to move kept sliding. Don't fight everything at once. Pick the one thing that moves and move it. Then pick the next thing. She picked the one thing that moved, the rope. It was fraying. She could feel it in the change in texture, the way it caught differently against the nail on the upstroke. She pushed harder, stopped caring about the ache in her wrists, and worked it until her arms burned, and then kept working. The rope broke on one side, then the other. Her hands came free. She sat very still for a moment, bringing her arms around in front of her and letting the blood back in, biting down against the pins and needles burn of returning circulation. Then she stood up, tested her legs, found them solid, and looked at the south door. 2 hands, specific angle. She'd only seen it once, but she remembered. She crossed the barn in the dark without making a sound and felt along the door frame until she found the bar and the bracket and the particular resistance of the mechanism, and she worked it the way she'd worked the rope, careful and patient, doing it once correctly rather than quickly and wrong. The bar lifted. She pushed the door open 1 inch and looked through the gap. Night. The town of Caldwell was quiet, most windows dark, a single lamp burning in the front room of the house across the yard. Malachi's house. She recognized the roofline. She had no weapon. She had no horse. She had no ledger. She had everything Harlan had told her, and everything she'd taught herself before she ever met him, and enough fury to fuel a walk across glass if that was what the situation required. She thought about Malachi's church study, the adoption papers. If the ledger was gone, the papers were the next piece of evidence that could lead to Clara. He was careful. She knew that he kept records of everything. He'd still have them. She pushed the door open wider and slipped out. The cold grabbed her, but she moved through it, keeping to the shadow of the barn wall, not thinking past the next step and the one after that. There was a root cellar door at the side of the house that she knew from months of watching the layout of the property. The cook used it every morning. It opened into the back hall. She moved. Behind her, in a creek 6 miles north and 2,000 feet higher, Harlan Cross washed up on a gravel bar. He lay face down in the rocks for a minute, completely spent, water pouring off him, the cold so complete it had gone past sensation into a kind of enormous blankness. He knew about hypothermia. He knew what the blankness meant and how much time it gave him. And pushed. It took 3 tries to get upright. He sat on the gravel bar and looked at the creek and breathed and took stock. The rib graze had stiffened in the cold water. His rifle was gone, lost in the fall. He had his sidearm, which had stayed in its holster. He had the knife on his belt. He had his coat, which was soaked through and doing almost nothing for him, but was better than nothing. He needed fire. He needed it within the hour, or the blankness was going to win. He stood up and looked at the canyon walls and found the game trail above the gravel bar and started climbing. The tribe found him before he found fire. 2 young men on horseback, checking traps in the upper canyon, came around a bend in the trail and pulled up short. He probably looked terrible, soaking, white-faced, moving badly. He held up one hand and tried to look non-threatening, which he suspected he managed poorly. One of the men said something to the other. The other nodded. They took him to the winter camp without discussion. He was too cold to argue and too grateful to try. Someone built a fire up close and put dry blankets on him and put hot liquid in his hands. And he sat with the blankets pulled tight and the fire burning and let the warmth work back into his body, degree by degree. He sat there and thought about Joe. He thought about what he'd seen on the trail before the creek. Took him the chaos of the ambush. Locke's men closing in, Joe's rifle cracking from the mare's back with everything she had. He thought about the silence that had followed him into the water. He thought about his sister, the farmhouse doorway, the specific paralysis of arriving too late and knowing it and being unable to make his legs work anyway. The guilt he'd carried, since then, like something bolted to his spine, heavy and permanent and entirely his. He sat with it, and then slowly, something shifted. Joe was not his sister. Joe had the Winchester and the knowledge of how to use it, and she had more resourcefulness in her bound hands than most people had in their full freedom. He had spent 6 weeks watching her reconstruct herself from the ground up, and what she'd built was not fragile. She was not waiting to be saved. She never had been. But that wasn't the same as saying he shouldn't go. It wasn't the same as saying she shouldn't have someone at her back. He'd had men at his back for 4 years in the cavalry, capable men, men who could handle themselves, and it had mattered. It had mattered every time. He looked at the man tending the fire across from him, who met his eyes without hostility, without curiosity, with the calm patience of someone who had decided a person needed help and was giving it without requiring an account of why. Harlan thought about what it cost to carry guilt alone, what it cost to decide the weight was yours alone to bear. He'd been doing that for 20 years, and it had not made him better or lighter or more capable. It had just made him solitary. He exhaled, long and slow. Something released in his chest that had been locked in place for longer than he could accurately name. "I need a horse," he said. The man across the fire considered him for a moment. Then he spoke to someone behind Harlan in a language Harlan didn't know. A horse was brought. He thanked them the best way he could, with gesture, and with the sincerity that didn't need a shared language, and he rode out of the camp at a pace his body protested, and he overruled, because Joe was somewhere in that valley below, and the morning was coming fast, and he did not intend to be late. Not this time. Not again. The root cellar door was unlocked. Joe had been counting on that. Malachi ran a household built on the appearance of righteousness, which meant visible locks on the front door, and trusting God or fear to manage the rest. She slipped inside and pulled the door shut behind her and stood still in the dark, letting her ears do the work. The house was quiet, a clock ticking somewhere above her, the pop and settle of a banked fire. She climbed the cellar stairs slowly, testing each step before putting her weight on it, staying close to the wall where the boards were less likely to flex. At the top, a door, not latched. She eased it open and stepped into the back hall. The study was at the front of the house, off the main corridor. She'd memorized the layout in the months she'd spent inside these walls, mapping it the way a person maps an unfamiliar place when they already understand. They may eventually need to leave it fast. She moved through the dark without a lamp. 4 steps to the corridor. Turn left. Past the kitchen door, a line of pale orange light showing under it. The banked stove still breathing past the parlor to the study door at the end. Locked. She stood there for a moment, hand on the knob. She thought about the mechanics of it. It was an old lock, a simple pin mechanism, the kind she'd seen Malachi open with a small brisk key. He kept on a ring with 3 others. He wore that ring on his belt during the day. At night, he put it on the study desk. She'd watched him do it countless times. She thought about what Harlan had said about picking the one thing that moves. The lock was not the one thing that moved. She looked at the door frame. The hinges were on her side old cast iron, the screws in them loose from years of the door swinging on its own weight. She'd noticed that too back then, filed it away as information without knowing why. She braced her shoulder against the door, got her fingers around the edge at hinge side, and applied slow, steady pressure inward and upward simultaneously, the direction that would take the weight off the hinge pins, and let them slide. The top pin came out of its barrel with a soft, dull sound. She worked the bottom one. It took longer. Her arms shook from the effort, and she made herself breathe and keep the pressure even. It came. She lifted the door free of its frame on the hinge side, swung it inward on the lock side, and stepped into the study. The desk was by the window. A faint bar of moonlight fell across it enough. The key ring was where she knew it would be, coiled on the corner beside the inkwell. She didn't need it now. She set it aside and started opening drawers. Malachi's filing system was meticulous, alphabetical, dated, labeled in his precise small hand. He had folders for sermons, for correspondence, for property records. She went through them fast, not hurrying enough to be careless, not careful enough to be slow. The adoption papers were in a folder marked charitable placements. She almost laughed, the cold, bureaucratic audacity of it. She took the folder. She took the 3 pages of correspondence beneath it that named the broker in Denver. She took the ledger it was in the bottom drawer, still in the oilskin, exactly as she'd packed it. They'd taken it off her and brought it straight here. Of course they had. This was what Malachi wanted most of all. She tucked everything inside her shirt, against her skin, and went back to the door. She was replacing the hinge pins quietly, meticulously, leaving nothing visibly disturbed when she heard boots on the porch, not Locke. The footstep was lighter, a younger man, probably the one Malachi kept as a night watch since the winter started. She'd forgotten about the watch. That was a mistake, and she filed it away as one and kept moving, faster now, back down the corridor to the kitchen. The front door opened as she reached the kitchen. She went through the kitchen without stopping, pushed the cellar door, went down the stairs, and was out the root cellar door and flat against the outside wall of the house before the footsteps inside had reached the corridor. She waited. No shout, no alarm. She pushed off the wall and moved into the shadow of the fence line, working her way around the back of the property toward the edge of town. She needed a horse. The livery stable was 2 blocks east, on the main road, which was a problem. Main road meant exposure. She thought about it while she moved, weighed the risk of the road against the risk of staying in town on foot, with morning coming. The livery it was. She was halfway there when she heard Locke behind her. He'd gone to the barn to check on her sooner than she'd expected, which was her second mistake of the night. She heard his shout from 2 blocks away, wordless and furious, and then heard him call for the others. She stopped calculating and started running. The livery stable's side door was unlatched. Livery stable doors in small towns rarely weren't, and she went through it and moved down the row of stalls fast, looking for a saddled horse and not finding one. She didn't have time to saddle. She grabbed a bridle off the wall hook, went to the nearest stall, spoke low and quick to the horse inside a big bay, calm enough, curious, and got the bridle on him in under a minute. Bareback. Fine. She'd ridden bareback on her uncle's farm until she was 12, and the memory lived in her body the way those early memories did, below conscious thought. She led the bay to the side door, checked the alley clear, and swung up. Locke came around the corner of the livery at a dead run, and she was already moving, already putting distance between them, the bay responding to her legs without question. She heard him shout. She heard the crack of a shot that went wide and hit the fence, so 6 feet to her left. She didn't look back. She bent low over the horse's neck and rode for the north road. What happened next, she didn't plan. She'd been heading for open ground, for the road out of town, for distance, but she was passing the church. Malachi's church, dark now, the white clapboard turning pale gray in the pre-dawn light, the stained glass window above the door. Catching nothing yet. She pulled up. Locke was behind her. She had maybe 2 minutes. She had the ledger. She had the adoption papers. She had the correspondence. She had a horse and a head start. She could ride north right now and meet Harlan somewhere on the mountain road, if he was alive. She sat on the horse in the empty street and looked at the church. and thought about what running meant and what staying meant. Then she thought about what Harlan had told her the afternoon he first put the Winchester in her hands. That it was not about what a man could do or what a woman couldn't. It was about what a person decided to claim for themselves. She pulled the horse to the side of the road, behind the church, and tied him to the fence post. She'd seen Locke's horse hitched outside the saloon, where he'd been drinking the evening before. She went to it, unbitched it, smacked its flank, and watched it canter off down the south road. Then she went back to the bay and checked the papers against her skin and settled in to wait. Locke came around the corner on foot, breathing hard, and she stepped out of the shadow with Harlan's tactical logic, organized inside her head, the advice he'd given her about lines of sight, about using the terrain, about making a man face the light instead of the dark. She had Locke between her and the eastern horizon, which was just starting to gray. She had a horse. He had neither. "It's over," she said. She kept her voice level. She wanted him to understand she wasn't frightened. She was past frightened. "I have everything. The ledger, the papers, the correspondence, all of it. And you're standing in the middle of the street without a horse at 4 in the morning." He looked at her. His hand moved toward his holster. She already had the sidearm up. She'd taken it from the barn when she'd freed herself, slipped it from the peg by the door. In the dark, another piece of information she'd cataloged and kept. She had it aimed and steady. "Don't," she said. He went still. "You're going to walk back to the boarding house," she said, "and you're going to think carefully about whether Malachi Stone is worth dying for." She held his gaze. "He's not paying you enough for this. You know that." A long pause. The wind moved through the empty street. Locke looked at the gun. He looked at her face. He seemed to be doing his own calculation, his own weighing of odds. He took his hand away from his holster. She didn't lower the gun until he'd walked back around the corner, and she heard the boarding house door open and close. Then she stood in the street for a moment, gun at her side, breathing. Then she got on the horse and rode. Sunday came in, clear and cold. The sun rose sharp over the eastern ridge and hit Caldwell's Main Street like something that had made up its mind. By 9 o'clock, people were moving toward the church in their good clothes, the congregation gathering the way it did every week, by habit and expectation and the particular social gravity of a small town. Reverend Malachi Stone stood at the pulpit. His right hand was wrapped. He'd told his congregation it was a burn from the hearth, and they'd accepted it, the way. They accepted most things he told them without question, with concern, with the specific deference given to a man of God who had never given them reason to doubt him. He was composed this morning. He was always composed. He'd had 4 days since the road, since Locke's report, since the failure at the pass, and he'd used those 4 days to prepare himself for the possibility of confrontation, and to convince himself it would not come. The ledger was gone. Joe was gone. Locke had disappeared 2 days ago without word. But the territorial capital was 3 days' ride from here, and it was Sunday, and on Sunday the people of Caldwell came to hear him preach, and there was still power in that if he held it correctly. He opened his Bible to the text he'd chosen. "Submission," he said, his voice settling into the particular resonance he'd cultivated for 30 years, a virtue that the modern world is beginning to question, and in questioning to lose. To submit is not weakness. To submit is not defeat. It is the God-ordained order of the oak doors at the back of the church opened. They opened hard, both of them at once. The sound traveled the full length of the aisle, through the rows of seated congregation, up to the pulpit, and Malachi stopped speaking. The sunlight came in first, a broad, white flood of it from the open doors, turning the figures in the entrance into silhouettes. Then, as his eyes adjusted, the details. Spurs. He heard them first, a sharp, clean ring on the stone floor, with every step, the sound of them echoing off the walls, in a silence that had become absolute. The man was tall and wore a duster coat, caked with trail mud and dried blood. He walked with a slight stiffness on the left side that didn't slow him. His rifle was raised. He stopped at the end of the aisle. bloodied, bruised, eyes completely steady. Harlan Cross looked at Malachi Stone across the length of the church and didn't say a word. For a moment, nobody moved. The congregation sat in a silence so complete that the sound of the stained glass window creaking in the wind above Malachi's head was audible. Then, from the shadows to the left of the pulpit, the small door that led from the side alley into the chancel, the door that the choir used, the door that Malachi himself used when he wanted to enter dramatically. Jo stepped out. She walked to the center of the chancel and stood at the top of the aisle steps, shoulder to shoulder, with the empty space between herself and Harlan, and the distance between them closed to nothing as Harlan moved up the aisle and came to stand beside her, shoulder to shoulder, both of them facing Malachi. The color had left Malachi's face. He gripped the edge of the pulpit with his good hand. Jo looked out at the congregation. She recognized faces, people she'd taught, mothers of children she'd known, men who'd tipped their hats to her on the road before Malachi had her locked away. She held up the ledger. "My name is Josephine Mercer," she said. Her voice carried, without effort, she'd been a teacher, and a teacher learned early how to fill a room. "I was the school teacher here. Some of you remember me. Most of you were told I'd suffered a breakdown and been sent away." She let that settle. "I was held in this man's house against my will for 6 months. He assaulted me. He stole my child and sold her to a broker in Denver, and he has done it before. Many times." Murmuring ran through the pews. She opened the ledger and read 4 names from it. Just 4. The first 4 entries, each one a child's description, a date, a dollar amount, a receiving family. Each one landing in the silence of the church like something dropped from a height. By the 3rd name, a woman in the 3rd pew had both hands over her mouth. "This ledger is in Reverend Stone's hand," Jo said. "Every page, every entry." She looked directly at Malachi. "I'm presenting it to the territorial governor's office today, along with the adoption correspondence and the transaction records from his study." Malachi's voice came back to him then. It was quieter than usual, but it had the shape of authority he'd spent decades building. "This woman is disturbed." "She's been don't," said Harlan. Just the one word, flat and final. The kind of voice that had given orders in situations where the orders were the last thing standing between order and disaster. Malachi stopped. He looked at Harlan. He looked at the rifle. He made a calculation. He reached under the pulpit. He'd kept the revolver there for 4 years. He'd never thought he'd need it for this for a Sunday morning, in his own church, in front of his own congregation. But the ledger was the ledger, and the woman was still standing, and the evidence in her hands was the kind that ended careers and started trials. His hand closed on the handle. Jo shot it out of his hand. The revolver spun off the edge of the pulpit and hit the floor 10 feet away. Malachi stumbled back against the wall behind him, cradling his hand, and the church erupted, people on their feet, shouting, children crying, and through all of it. Jo stood at the top of the aisle steps, with the sidearms still level, and her feet planted firm and her face completely calm. The calm of someone who had already decided, long before this moment, that she would not flinch. Harlan had crossed to the pulpit. He stood over the revolver on the floor with his boot on it and looked up at Malachi. "On your knees," he said. Malachi Stone, in his church, on a Sunday morning, with sunlight blazing through the stained glass behind him, and his congregation watching, got on his knees. The territorial marshals arrived within the hour. They'd been in town since Thursday, posted there at Harlan's request after he'd made it to Helena on the borrowed horse, and spent 6 hours in the governor's office making the case before Jo arrived with the ledger the following morning. Aldridge had listened to Harlan, had listened to Jo, had looked at the oilskin-wrapped ledger and the adoption papers and the broker correspondence, and had sent 4 marshals south ahead of a formal arrest warrant that was signed and sealed before dawn on Saturday. The marshals had been waiting. They'd been told to wait for Sunday morning. Jo had asked for Sunday morning specifically, and Aldridge had agreed, and Harlan had agreed, and nobody had needed to say out loud why it mattered to do this in the church, in front of the congregation, in the place where the lie had been told and maintained for years. Some truths needed to be spoken in the exact room where the lie had lived. Malachi was taken out in irons. He walked through his congregation without looking at them. He did not speak. The fraudulent warrant against Joe was dissolved in the same afternoon by a judge, who read the first 2 pages of the ledger and went pale. The broker's office was in Denver, on a street of well-maintained buildings that wore the respectable face of legitimate commerce. It took 3 weeks to get there. 3 weeks of legal proceedings, of depositions, of Joe sitting across from territorial lawyers, with the ledger open on the table between them, and speaking in clear and precise language about every date, every conversation, every deliberate act Malachi had committed and documented in his own hand. Harlan sat beside her for most of it, not to speak for her. She didn't need that. He was there so she wasn't sitting alone across a table from men in expensive suits who looked at her with the particular professional doubt they reserved for women who accused powerful men. She caught him there once, watching, and he saw her recognize what he was doing and why. She said nothing about it. She turned back to the lawyers and kept speaking. The governor's office moved fast once the warrant cleared. 4 of the families named in the ledger were contacted within the first week. 2 of them sent immediate replies. The broker in Denver, faced with a federal investigation and the specific itemized evidence of every transaction he'd conducted with Malachi Stone, cooperated within the first hour of questioning. Clara was with a family in the eastern part of Denver, a banker's family, a large house, a nurse retained specifically for the infant. The adoption papers they'd been given were false, but they hadn't known that, or so they said, and the investigation was still untangling the question of what they'd known and when. What mattered was that she was alive. She was alive, and she was 7 months old, and she had dark eyes and a small persistent frown that reminded Harlan, the first time he saw it, immediately and completely of her mother. He was standing in the hallway outside the room when Joe carried her out. He'd given her the space to go in alone. That was not a moment that needed a witness. He'd sat in a straight-backed chair in the hallway of the broker's facilitation office with his hat on his knee and listened to the silence of the closed door for 20 minutes. When the door opened and Joe came out, she was not crying. She'd done that in private. Her eyes were red-rimmed but dry, and her face had an expression he had never seen on it before, something that had no name in the language of the hard and the surviving, something that was simply whole. She was carrying Clara in the crook of her arm. The baby was awake, looking around with the focused, slightly baffled attention of a very young person encountering the world's details, one at a time. Joe looked at Harlan. He looked at Clara, then back at Joe. "Hello," he said to the baby, for lack of anything else. Clara looked at him, the persistent frown deepened by a degree. "She's skeptical," Joe said. "She has good instincts." Joe laughed, quietly and just briefly, but it was real, the first real laugh he'd heard from her, unguarded, and without anything careful behind it. It changed her whole face. He thought about the woman he'd carried in from the snow 6 months ago, frozen, bloody, gripping a burned ledger to her chest. He thought about the woman who had held a shaking blade over his leg and decided not to stop. He thought about the woman who had untied herself in a dark barn with a rusty nail, broken into a locked study, disarmed a bounty hunter, and walked into a church on a Sunday morning to speak the truth in front of everyone who'd believed the lie. He thought about his sister. He thought about her the way he'd been trying to learn to think about her with grief and with the specific guilt that he was still carrying. But without the paralysis, without the belief that her loss was a debt he owed the world in perpetuity, to be paid in solitude and silence, and the deliberate avoidance of anything he might fail to protect. You could grieve without being buried in it. He was learning that. He stood up and held his hands out toward Clara. He looked at Joe first, asking. She shifted Clara toward him. He took her carefully. She was heavier than she looked, dense and present in his arms, and she stared at him with those serious dark eyes and continued to evaluate his worth as a human being. "She'll come around," Joe said. "I'll earn it," he said. They rode back to Montana in the first week of June. The mountains were green at the lower elevations. The snow retreated to the high peaks, the creeks full and loud with snowmelt. The ranch came into view on the second afternoon, the cabin, the barn with its new timber pale on the north side, the pasture fence running straight and solid along the ridge. The mare had foaled in April, a filly dark bay, long-legged and suspicious of everything, currently standing at the far end of the pasture, looking offended by the world. Joe saw her and went still for a moment. "You'll need to name her," Harlan said. Joe looked at the filly for a moment. "Something stubborn," she said. Obviously, they married in July, in the yard of the ranch, with 2 neighboring families as witnesses and a circuit preacher, who was nothing like Malachi Stone, a practical, plain-spoken man who read the necessary words without flourish and seemed genuinely pleased to be there. The ceremony was short. The dinner afterward was not. Joe wore a dress she'd made herself from cloth. Harlan had bought in Billings green wool, practical and well cut. She looked like herself in it. That was what he noticed most. Not dressed up or dressed down, just entirely herself. He thought about telling her that. He told her instead that she'd hemmed it perfectly, and she said she was aware. And that was about right for the 2 of them. Winter came back in November, the way it always did in those mountains, all at once and without apology. The first real snow fell on a Tuesday, and by evening it was serious, and by morning the world outside had gone white and quiet and complete. Harlan sat by the hearth with Clara in his arms. She was 11 months old now, pulling herself to standing on every available surface, loudly convinced that language was imminent. She sat in the crook of his arm and looked at the fire with the same focused frown she'd been born with, and seemed to find everything satisfactory. Joe came in from checking the horses, stomping snow from her boots, pulling off her gloves. She looked at the 2 of them, and something moved across her face, private and unguarded, the expression of a person who had spent a long time surviving and was still learning, carefully and with some disbelief, what it felt like to be more than that. Harlan looked up at her, then down at Clara. "You will grow up in a world," he said quietly, speaking to the baby, speaking to Joe, speaking to the room and the fire and the snow outside, where your voice carries just as much weight as any man's. He looked at Clara's serious, evaluating face. "And no one will ever strip away your freedom or your dignity." Clara grabbed his finger with both hands and appeared to consider the terms acceptable. Joe sat down beside him, close, her shoulder against his. She looked at their daughter in his arms, and she looked at the fire, and she said nothing, because there was nothing left that needed saying. Outside, the snow fell the way it had fallen, the night he'd found her total and indifferent. And without mercy, the mountains doing what mountains did. But inside the cabin, the fire was going, and the lamp was lit. And 3 people, who had come through fire of a different kind, entirely were sitting warm in the middle of it. 2 damaged souls. One daughter who would inherit something neither of her parents had been given at the start, a world that had been forced, through evidence and testimony, and the specific courage of a woman who refused to stop, to reckon with what it owed her. The storm could do its worst. They were already home. There's a moment in this story that I keep coming back to. Not the gunfight, not the church showdown, not even the moment Joe walked out of that barn with her hands free and nothing but fury and intelligence to carry her forward. It's quieter than all of that. It's Harlan, standing in a snowstorm, finding a woman face down in the dark, and instead of demanding to know who she was or what she'd done, he simply picked her up and carried her inside. And then, the next morning, instead of handing her a broom, he handed her a ledger and said, "Can you keep accounts?" That's it. That's the whole thing. Not a grand speech. Not a declaration. Just a man who looked at a broken, frightened, unnamed woman and saw without being told that she was intelligent, capable, and deserving of work that matched who she actually was. He didn't rescue her. He made room for her to rescue herself. And that, I think, is what this story is really about. We talk a lot about strength. We put it on posters and print it on t-shirts and make movies where strength looks like someone who never cries, never shakes, never hesitates. But Jo's hands shook. They shook badly. She stood over that wound with a heated blade, and her whole body was fighting her because she had been hurt in ways that blades meant something specific and terrible. And she picked it up anyway. She committed. And the moment she did, the shaking stopped. That's not the absence of fear. That's courage. And there's a difference that matters enormously. Jo never stopped being afraid. She was afraid in that barn, working a nail in the dark with her wrists bound behind her. She was afraid in that church, standing in front of a congregation that had believed a lie about her for 6 months. But she had learned the hard way, in the worst possible school, that fear is information, not instruction. It tells you the stakes. It doesn't get to tell you whether to move. And then there's what the story says about the world that surrounded these two people. A world where a woman's testimony meant nothing without a man to vouch for it. Where a reverend with the right connections could steal a child and call it charity. Where the law was written by people who had decided in advance that certain lives mattered less than others. That world was not fiction. That was Tuesday in 1887. And Harlan's fury at that system, not performed, not political, just bone-deep and honest matters, because it came from someone who had watched it destroy someone he loved before he ever met Jo. He knew what that world cost. He'd paid part of the bill himself, in guilt he carried for 20 years over a sister he couldn't save under laws that gave him nothing to stand on. Thank you for spending this time with Jo and Harlan and Clara. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. And I'll see you in the next chapter. This story is a work of historical fiction created for entertainment and storytelling purposes only. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is entirely coincidental.